Buy me, Cowboy. I'm experienced and I can give you offspring, whispered the desperate Apache woman. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The trading yard sat at the edge of a dry town where the wind carried the smell of sweat, livestock, and old wood. Late afternoon light came in at a low angle, hitting the dust in the air so that every movement sent thin clouds drifting around the platforms. Traders shouted final offers while horses tugged against ropes, and tired men counted coins with irritated glances as the day drew closer to closing. The place was loud, sharp, and full of rushed decisions, the kind of environment that made most people tense the moment they stepped through the entrance. Eli Mercer stood near the far end of the yard with one hand resting lightly on the strap of his saddlebag. He had ridden in from his ranch 2 hours earlier, needing feed for his mule, cartridges for his rifle, and a handful of simple supplies: oil for door hinges, a new handle for his cooking pan, and maybe a small sack of flour if the price wasn't too steep. He preferred arriving late in the day because the crowd thinned, but today the yard still held too many people. Every raised voice made him tighten his jaw. Every sudden movement made him shift his eyes. He didn't like being surrounded, not after what had happened years ago when two of his brothers were killed during a dispute in a crowded saloon. Since then, he stayed alert in places like this, always watching for danger others didn't notice. He moved carefully between the stalls, ignoring most of what he saw. He had no interest in animals being auctioned or the loud traders trying to get attention. His goal was simple: buy what he needed and ride home before full dark. He intended to avoid the far platform completely until he caught sight of a young Apache woman standing with her wrists bound and her head tilted forward as if trying to keep consciousness. She looked dehydrated, exhausted, and past the point of hiding her pain. Her dress, made of deerskin with loose beadwork and torn tassels, showed signs of being pulled violently at the shoulders. The skin around her wrists was swollen from rope burn, and her breathing came shallow, as if she had been forced to stand under the sun too long without rest. Eli paused because something in her expression, fear mixed with stubbornness, pulled his attention before he could walk away. She lifted her chin when she noticed him stop. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with a desperate attempt to show strength she barely had left. Her voice cracked as she spoke, every word sounding like it took effort. "I'm experienced, Cowboy. By me, I could give you offspring." Eli had heard similar lines from people trying to avoid harsher buyers, but the way she said it made him feel something difficult to describe. It sounded like a sentence she had been forced to practice, not something she believed. He looked at her face more closely. There were small specks of dry blood near her hairline, a bruise on her forearm, and a stiffness in her posture that suggested she had been hit earlier in the day. She avoided looking directly at him, watching his chest instead, preparing herself for rejection or worse. He glanced toward the trader, standing nearby. The man was leaning against a post, chewing on a piece of straw, bored and impatient. "How long's she been up there?" Eli asked. "Since morning," the trader answered. "Had trouble keeping her still earlier. She'll settle once someone buys her." Eli felt tension build behind his ribs. He didn't like the way the trader spoke, didn't like the casual tone used when describing someone clearly worn down. "Price?" he asked. The trader gave a number without hesitation. Eli didn't bargain. He didn't even blink. He reached into his saddlebag, counted the coins slowly, and handed them over. The trader looked surprised that someone would pay full cost without negotiating, but he didn't complain. Once the money changed hands, the trader stepped aside. Eli approached her carefully, noting the way her shoulders tightened as he moved closer. He didn't grab her wrists. He didn't even touch the rope at first. He took out a small knife he kept for cutting twine on his ranch and lifted the binding gently so he wouldn't scrape her skin further. The rope was stiff from sweat and dirt, but he cut it cleanly in 2 motions. The ends fell to the ground. The woman drew her hands close to her chest as soon as they were free, rubbing the swollen skin with her fingertips. She looked at him with confusion, almost suspicious of his lack of haste. Eli stepped back to give her more room. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story, but he knew she was terrified and running on whatever strength she could still pull from her body. "You walk when you're steady," he said quietly, keeping his tone calm so he wouldn't startle her. She stared at him as if expecting a hidden demand, but he didn't speak again. He waited. She tried to step forward and stumbled slightly, catching herself with tense arms. Eli didn't move to assist. He let her find her balance at her own pace, because he understood how quickly fear could turn into panic if someone felt cornered. After a long moment, she stepped off the platform. The relief on her face was subtle, just a slight loosening of her jaw and a deeper breath, but Eli noticed. He led the way toward the exit, keeping 3 paces ahead so she could decide how close she wanted to be. As they moved away from the crowd, Eli's mind worked through what he had just done. He hadn't arrived intending to bring another person home. His life was simple, quiet, and built around routine. Adding another person, especially someone traumatized, would change that. But leaving her on that platform felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. He couldn't look at her and walk away knowing what kind of buyers were still wandering the yard. Behind him, the woman followed with careful steps, watching every shadow and every stranger as if expecting someone to drag her back. She didn't trust him yet. Her tense shoulders made that clear, but she moved behind him with the kind of caution that showed she preferred his path over the one behind her. Eli reached the edge of the yard where the noise faded, and the air felt less suffocating. He turned slightly to check on her, not wanting to make her uneasy by staring. She held her arms close to her ribs and kept her eyes moving constantly, scanning everything just as he did. He recognized the behavior. It was survival, pure and simple. He stopped near his horse and mule, letting her decide how close to come. "I'm heading west," he said, keeping his voice steady. "If you walk with me, no one here will follow." She didn't answer right away. She studied his face with a long, cautious stare, trying to understand the kind of man he was. Fear lingered, but something in her posture shifted ever so slightly. Not trust, but the beginning of relief. After a few seconds, she gave a small nod, the first voluntary choice she had made all day. Eli adjusted the mule's lead and guided it toward the trail. The woman walked beside him, still tense, still unsure, but moving forward with more certainty than before. Neither of them spoke again, but each step away from the market lifted a weight that had pressed on both of them for far too long. The road ahead was quiet, open, and unknown, yet it felt safer than anything behind them. And for the first time since morning, she walked without someone pulling her by a rope. The road leaving the market stretched into open land where the noise of barter and shouting faded until it felt like a memory from another life. The woman kept a cautious distance behind Eli, her steps light but uneven, as if her legs still struggled to remember what it meant to walk without restraints. Eli didn't hurry. He kept a steady pace that matched the mule's slow gait, giving her space to move the way she needed. The sun dipped lower, cooling the air enough that she finally exhaled without the tightness that had gripped her since morning. They reached a small rise where the trail widened. Eli stopped beside a weather-beaten fence post that had fallen long ago, the wood gray and splintered from years of wind. He turned slightly toward her, careful not to startle her. "You should ride for a while," he said, gesturing to the mule. "Your legs aren't ready for distance." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, not at the offer itself, but at what men usually expected after making one. She studied him for several seconds, looking for any shift in his posture that might reveal an unspoken demand. When she found none, she let her shoulders lower just a fraction. She climbed onto the mule with slow movements, both hands gripping the worn saddle horn until she settled. Eli took hold of the lead rope and continued walking. The sound of their steps blended with the soft clink of the mule's gear, creating a rhythm that felt steadier than the frantic noise of the market. The woman watched Eli's back as he walked. He kept his shoulders squared and his pace even, and she realized he hadn't once looked over his shoulder to check whether she was following. That detail told her more about him than anything he had said so far. He wasn't treating her like someone who might run or cause trouble. He was treating her like a traveler who simply walked with him. Minutes passed before she finally spoke. Her voice carried less strain than before, though it still trembled around the edges. "You didn't ask my name. I figured you'd say it when you were ready," Eli answered without stopping. The honesty in his tone surprised her. She had been owned, traded, pushed, and handled by men who spoke at her, not with her. His answer didn't sound rehearsed or calculated. It sounded like a man stating a simple truth. She took a breath that reached deeper into her chest. "Naira," she said quietly. Eli nodded once, acknowledging without pressing for more. She noticed that he didn't repeat her name or misuse it, something that had happened to her since she was taken. She didn't expect him to understand how much that small detail mattered, but it eased something in her that had been locked for too long. As the land opened around them, Eli slowed near a narrow stream bed, dry from lack of rain, but still lined with smooth stones. He knelt down to check the tracks along its edge. Naira watched him with growing tension, remembering the men who had hunted her earlier in the month. She knew the sound of their horses, the way they shouted to one another, and the rough handling she endured when they dragged her from hiding. The fear washed through her again, sharp and immediate, tightening her stomach. Eli noticed her rigid posture as he stood. "You expect someone to be following," he said, not asking, but observing. She looked away toward the horizon. "They sold me because they lost patience. Some men will want me back. Not for good reasons." Eli's jaw worked for a moment, his eyes scanning the land the way only someone with experience could. "Tracks here are old," he said. "Two riders passed yesterday, heading west. Nothing fresh." She searched his expression, looking for false comfort, but his face held the same steady seriousness it always did. He wasn't dismissing her fear, he was giving her facts. That grounded her more than reassurance would have. They continued forward until the land dipped into a shallow basin bordered by scattered juniper trees. The area offered enough cover to rest without feeling trapped. Eli tied the mule loosely and set his saddlebag near a flat rock. He removed a folded cloth containing dried meat and a small tin of ground corn. He didn't hand anything directly to her. He laid the food on the rock where she could take it without feeling pressured. As she reached for the meat, she hesitated. "Why did you come to the market?" she asked. "You didn't look like someone searching for someone like me." Eli sat on the ground with his back against a tree trunk. "Needed supplies," he said. "Didn't plan on leaving with anything but feed." "So why stop?" she asked, the question leaving her before she could filter it. Eli rubbed the back of his neck, thinking through his answer instead of speaking quickly. "I saw someone who shouldn't have been there," he said. That was enough. She ate in silence, taking small bites as her body adjusted. She had gone long stretches without food before, and she knew eating too fast would make her stomach twist. Eli watched the land while she ate, scanning the ridges, listening to distant sounds, and checking the light as it faded behind the hills. Naira studied him. He carried a tension around his shoulders that didn't come from her presence, but from old memories he didn't talk about. She recognized that kind of weight. People didn't carry themselves like that unless something in their past had left a mark that never fully healed. When she finished eating, she spoke softly. "You look like someone who left something behind." Eli didn't react right away, but his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I did," he said finally. "A long time ago. Doesn't matter now." "It matters," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her tone. "Things don't leave a person just because time passes." He gave her a brief glance that carried more depth than any answer he could have spoken. She realized then why he walked the way he did, steady, watchful, always sensing danger before it arrived. He had lived through something that taught him to expect loss. She knew that knowledge too well. As the light dimmed further, he collected enough fallen wood to build a small fire. He didn't ask if she wanted the warmth. He simply lit it because the temperature was dropping and her arms were still trembling from exhaustion. She moved closer to the flames, holding her hands out carefully. A new thought crossed her mind, one she hadn't dared consider until now. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, voice steady but cautious. Eli tightened the strap on his boot and met her eyes. "To my place," he said. "Far from here. You'll be safe there." "What do you expect from me?" she asked, pushing the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest since he cut the rope. "Nothing," he said. She stared at him, waiting for the rest. but he didn't add anything. Nothing, she repeated quietly. Not a thing, he said, his expression firm in a way that left no room for doubt. Naira felt her chest loosen in a way she hadn't experienced in months. She had been waiting for the hidden condition, the demand, the moment when his kindness turned into something she owed. It didn't come. The absence of it startled her more than any threat would have. As the fire crackled between them and the wind settled over the basin, Naira finally allowed her breathing to slow. Her fear didn't vanish, but it shifted, giving room for something she hadn't felt since long before she was captured: cautious relief. They sat without speaking for a long time. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, real, a space where neither had to pretend they were stronger or braver than they felt. When the last light faded completely and the stars began to show, Eli adjusted his hat lower over his eyes. "Get some rest," he said. "We move early." Naira laid down a few feet from the fire, pulling the blanket he offered around her shoulders. She watched him until sleep blurred her vision. He stayed awake longer, listening to every sound, making sure no one approached in the dark. For the first time since she had been taken from her band, she slept without expecting to wake up in chains. Dawn crept in quietly, bringing a pale band of light that stretched across the basin and revealed the soft outline of juniper branches above them. The fire had burned down to faint embers, still giving off enough warmth to keep the chill from settling into their bones. Eli was already awake, sitting against a rock with his hat pushed back slightly, scanning the land with the same deliberate attention he had shown since leaving the market. His posture told Naira that he had slept lightly, if at all. She stirred beneath the blanket, blinking at the shifting colors of morning. For a moment, she forgot where she was, a brief instant where her mind jumped back to the place she had been taken from. When she saw Eli sitting nearby, the tension in her shoulders anchored her to the present. He didn't speak, but he gave a short nod, acknowledging that she was awake without crowding her. Her stomach tightened with hunger, something she had pushed aside for days. Eli noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she sat up. Without comment, he reached into his saddlebag and set a small wrapped portion of cornmeal and dried berries on the flat rock between them. He kept his distance, letting her decide when to take it. Naira hesitated only a second. She picked up the food, her fingers brushing the rough cloth. "Why do you keep placing things instead of handing them to me?" she asked, realizing it was something she had been wondering since the previous day. Eli shrugged lightly. "You've had enough hands on you," he said. "Figure you don't need more unless you ask." The answer struck her with unexpected force. Until now, she thought he was simply being cautious, but hearing the reason from his mouth made her chest tighten. She had grown used to being grabbed, pushed, positioned, and treated like property. His restraint felt unfamiliar in a way that made her throat ache. As she ate, she watched him check the mule's hooves, adjust the cinch, and tighten the strap on his saddle. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if measuring each task with care. His quietness wasn't the silence of someone hiding something. It was the silence of someone who had lived alone long enough to make stillness a habit. She swallowed the last bite of food. "How far is your place?" she asked. "A day and a half," he said. "More if the trail's soft." "And when we get there?" she asked, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of every forced move she'd endured over the past months. "You rest," he replied. "After that, you figure what you want to do." The simplicity of his answer made her pause. He wasn't claiming she belonged anywhere except where she chose to stand. She wrapped the blanket neatly and placed it beside the mule. Eli lifted a small water pouch and held it out, not directly to her hand, but extended enough that she could take it without brushing against him. She drank slowly, feeling the cool water hit her empty stomach. Once they were ready to leave, Eli stepped onto the trail first. Naira walked behind him for a few minutes before he glanced back. "You're stronger today than yesterday," he said. "You can ride or walk. Your choice." "I'll walk," she said. The decision wasn't about stubbornness. It was about proving to herself that she wasn't being dragged anymore. They moved across open land where low shrubs dotted the earth and patches of dry grass bent beneath the breeze. The land shifted in color from gray to brown to soft gold as the sun rose higher. Naira studied her surroundings carefully, wanting to remember every hill and rock formation in case she needed to retrace the path one day. Eli noticed her scanning the horizon and spoke quietly. "You think they'll come after you?" he said. "They might," she admitted. "The last man who traded me said I was worth more to others than to him." Eli's jaw tightened. He stopped briefly and studied the dry wash below them. "If anyone follows, they won't get close. I know this land better than they do." Naira wanted to believe that, but fear still crawled up the back of her neck. She pushed it down and asked the question that had lingered in her thoughts since yesterday. "From which direction did you come to the market? I want to know if our paths can be traced." "North Ridge," he said. "The soil's rocky. Hoofprints break up easy. They won't track us from there." She nodded slowly. It eased one of the worries she carried, the worry listeners would have wondered about, how traceable their trail was, whether someone could follow their movements or trap them at night. Eli was already thinking ahead, mapping danger before it arrived. After an hour of steady walking, Eli stopped at a sloped patch of ground where the soil had shifted. He crouched and brushed aside loose dirt with the back of his knuckles. Naira watched intently. "What is it?" she asked. "Fresh print," he said. "Single rider. Past the dawn." Their horse was tired, drag marks in the back hoof. He stood, shaking the dirt from his hands. "Not heading toward us. Just passing through." Naira studied his expression. He wasn't worried, but he wasn't ignoring the sign either. She realized he didn't rely on luck. He relied on observation, the kind of skill a man learns only after losing too much to carelessness. They continued until midday when they reached a cluster of large boulders that cast a cool shadow. Eli motioned for them to rest. Naira lowered herself onto a rock and stretched her legs, grateful for the change in pace. She watched him unfasten his hat and wipe the sweat from his brow. "Why do you live alone?" she asked, genuinely curious. She had wondered since the night before, but hadn't known if it was her place to ask. He didn't answer immediately. He finished adjusting his gear and sat down a few feet away. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee before he finally spoke. "After my brothers died, everything back home felt wrong," he said. "People asked questions I didn't want to answer. I had nothing left to stay for." He looked at the ground. "So I left." She absorbed his words slowly. His answer wasn't decorative or dramatic. It was direct, plain, and full of a quiet grief he wasn't trying to hide. It gave her a clearer picture of the man leading her through this rough land. Someone who understood loss on a level that didn't need explanation. "You think your brothers would want you alone?" she asked. He let out a slow breath. "I don't know what they'd want anymore." She didn't press further. Instead, she let the silence settle between them, comfortable and unforced. For the first time, the distance between them didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a space where two damaged people were allowed to breathe. After their short rest, they continued the trail until the landscape shifted again. A faint wisp of dust rose in the far distance, catching both their eyes. Naira stiffened instantly. "Riders!" Eli squinted into the sunlight, his body tense but controlled. "Two," he said. "Too far to tell direction. We'll move on to the ridge, keep elevation." Naira followed him quickly, trusting his judgment. The ridge offered a sweeping view of the valley below. From that vantage point, Eli tracked the riders' movement with trained precision. "They're heading south. Not toward us," he said. His voice carried certainty, calming the panic rising in her chest. Her heart steadied. She lowered her head, embarrassed by how quickly fear overtook her. Eli didn't comment on it. He simply adjusted his hat and continued walking, allowing her dignity to return on its own. As evening approached, they found a narrow alcove carved between two eroded cliffs. It was sheltered, hidden, and quiet, ideal for resting without risk. Naira sat on the ground, pulling her knees up as she watched Eli gather wood. She finally voiced the question listeners would certainly wonder. "Why didn't you turn me over to the marshal? Or a church house? Or anyone?" Eli paused, the wood in his hands shifting slightly. "Because those places decide your life for you," he said. "You've had enough people make decisions you didn't ask for." Her eyes softened, and her throat tightened with emotion she wasn't prepared to handle. She looked away before he saw the tremor in her jaw. No one had ever spoken about her autonomy like that. No one had considered what she might want. As night settled and the fire crackled inside the alcove, she realized this journey was changing something inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. A growing belief that she could choose her future, not through fear, not through force, but through the simple act of walking beside a man who gave her space to breathe. She lay down near the fire, her heart beating slower than it had since the day she was taken. Eli stayed awake longer, listening for any distant sound, his eyes moving over the land with the steady caution of a man who knew danger rarely announced itself before striking. And for the first time, Naira felt the possibility that tomorrow might not be another day of running. It might be the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for, but trusted enough to keep walking toward. The night faded slowly, letting the pale morning light slip into the narrow alcove where Naira and Eli had rested. The air held a cool bite, enough to wake the muscles in Naira's back as she pushed herself upright. She blinked at the faint glow of the fire's last embers, remembering how easily she had fallen asleep, something her body wasn't used to after months of fear. Eli sat a few feet away, sharpening a small blade with quiet, even strokes, his expression unreadable but alert. He lifted his gaze just long enough to check if she was steady. She nodded, though sleep still clung to her bones. The silence between them carried a different weight than before, no longer filled with suspicion, but not yet comfortable enough to be called trust. Something in between, something fragile but growing. Naira wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and studied the ground near the alcove entrance. It bothered her that she didn't know what direction they had taken the day she was captured. She didn't want to be lost in her own land. She hesitated before asking, "Which way leads back to my people? If there is a chance I return someday, I should know." Eli rested the blade on his knee and scratched a rough outline in the dirt with the tip of a broken twig. "Your band stayed near the high mesa?" he asked. "They moved often, but yes, before the trouble started." "Then you came from the east," he said, marking a line. "We're heading northwest. If you wanted to return, you'd have to cross two ridges and a dry creek that cuts deep. Not safe alone." Naira watched him draw the landscape, absorbing every detail. His knowledge of this land was broader than she expected. She had wondered silently since the first day whether Eli was familiar with Apache territory or simply a rancher who wandered too far. Now she understood. He had studied this ground for years, not as a settler claiming it, but as a man who walked it to keep himself alive. When they set out again, Naira walked beside him instead of behind. She didn't make a conscious decision to close the distance. It just happened as the trail curved through rocky terrain where walking single file felt unnatural. Eli didn't comment on the change. He only adjusted his steps so she wouldn't trip on uneven ground. As they climbed higher along the ridge, the land opened in a sweep of valleys and broken hills. Naira paused halfway up, staring at a cluster of cottonwoods far below. "That's where they held me last," she said quietly, "before selling me." Her breath shook, not from exertion, but from memory. Eli looked down, following her gaze. He didn't ask her to continue. He didn't ask questions that would tear open wounds she was barely stitching shut. Instead, he scanned the basin carefully, noting the old path carved by wagon wheels leading toward it. "No one's down there now," he said. "Tracks are washed out. Looks abandoned." The relief that crossed Naira's face wasn't subtle. It was the kind that loosened her hands and softened her stance. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The tension that left her body said enough. They continued until midday when the trail dipped into a narrow pass lined with large stone outcroppings. As they stepped into the shade, Naira slowed, noticing something the listeners would question if left unexplained. A faint mark carved into the rock wall, a symbol from her band used to warn of hostile territory. She touched the carving lightly. "This wasn't here long," she said. "Maybe 2 moons." Eli examined the mark with calm interest. "Means someone survived," he said. He didn't smile, but something eased in his expression. It was the first hopeful evidence she had seen since the day she was dragged from her people. Listeners would have wondered whether her band still lived, whether she had any family left. This symbol answered the first piece. Someone had passed this way, someone who knew how to leave a sign without getting caught. Naira stepped back from the stone, swallowing a tight breath. If someone survived, maybe my sister did. Eli rested his hand on the mule's bridle, keeping his voice steady. You'll find out when the time's right. The reassurance wasn't loud, wasn't emotional. It was measured and sincere, exactly the kind she could accept without feeling smothered. They moved deeper into the pass until Eli stopped suddenly and raised a hand for silence. Naira froze instantly, her body tightening. Eli pointed to a shallow depression in the dirt where two clear hoof prints cut through the soft ground. Fresh, not more than an hour old. The direction was unclear, but the size and spacing told Eli more than enough. Riders came through fast, he murmured, not following us, moving toward the plains. Naira watched his eyes narrow slightly, and her heartbeat thudded in her ears. What if they come back? She whispered. They won't, he said. They're passing through. They're not searching. If they were, they'd slow at the junction behind us. His certainty steadied her pulse. Still, she realized something crucial. He read tracks and terrain like another man read printed words. The listeners would have wondered how he could be so sure about danger or safety. This was the answer. He had lived alone long enough to become fluent in signs most men overlooked. The trail widened once they emerged from the pass. The wind picked up, tugging gently at Naira's loose braid. She adjusted it with quick fingers, embarrassed by how disheveled she felt after so many days without proper rest. Eli noticed, but didn't comment. Instead, he said something she didn't expect. When we reach my place, there's water close by. You can wash, cut your hair if you want, or just rest in the shade. Naira stopped walking for a moment, surprised by the detail. You've thought about this already? I've lived there long enough to know what someone needs their first day, he answered. She understood then. He had taken in wandering souls before. Maybe not many, maybe only once or twice, but enough to know the first hours of safety overwhelmed a person who had lived with fear pressed into their skin. She wondered how many he had helped, whether any had stayed or if they eventually moved on. It made her curious, but she didn't ask yet. As the afternoon stretched on, they reached a natural overlook where Eli paused to check the horizon. The land dropped away in gentle slopes leading toward distant pines. Naira stepped beside him, shading her eyes with one hand. You said you lived alone for years, she said. What made you stay in that place? Why not move on? Eli kicked a small stone over the edge, watching it bounce down the slope. The farther I went, the less I found that made sense, he said. That cabin, it's quiet. Doesn't ask anything from me. Felt like the only place where nothing hunted me. Naira absorbed that. Another piece of him she hadn't known. He wasn't running from the world anymore. He was holding on to the one place where he didn't feel like he had to explain himself. As they prepared to continue, a new concern crossed Naira's mind. Something listeners would question immediately. What will people in town think? She asked. If they see me with you? Eli answered without hesitation, his voice steady. They won't see you. My place isn't near any settlement. Only people who ride that way are lost. The reassurance was grounding. Her fear of being recognized, reclaimed, or judged settled enough for her shoulders to ease again. The last stretch of daylight cast long shadows across the ground as they descended the ridge. Naira walked more closely now, not because she needed protection, but because the distance between them no longer felt necessary. She found herself studying the line of his jaw, the way he tightened his grip on the lead rope when the trail narrowed, the way he angled his body slightly toward her when they crossed unstable ground. They reached a flat clearing near dusk. Eli stopped, scanning the grass for movement, then nodded. We'll make camp here. Close enough to cover. Far enough from the streams to avoid night visitors. Naira gathered small sticks as Eli built a fire. When the flames took shape, she sat near the warmth, watching the colors of sunset blend into the land. For the first time since she had been taken, she felt a small, steady certainty rise inside her. A quiet instinct telling her she was walking toward a place where she could breathe without fear. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't have to. Eli saw it in the way her eyes softened and although he didn't smile, something in his expression shifted, a faint easing of the weight he carried, as if the journey ahead no longer belonged to him alone. And as the sky darkened fully, they sat in silence that no longer felt like distance, but like the start of something they were both learning to trust. The fire from the previous night had burned down to a thin circle of ash by the time Eli opened his eyes. Dawn pressed softly across the clearing, revealing the outline of Naira sitting near a fallen log with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She hadn't noticed him wake yet. Her attention was fixed on the tree-line, studying each flicker of movement with the instinct of someone who had spent years surviving through caution. Eli watched her quietly, noting that she no longer flinched at every rustle and no longer held her breath the way she had on the first night. Fear still lived inside her, but it no longer controlled every part of her body. He stood, dusted off his trousers, and stretched the stiffness from his back. She finally turned, her eyes softening when she saw him. "You sleep at all?" she asked. "Some," he said. "Enough." It wasn't entirely true, but he didn't say more. He had spent most of the night listening for riders or wandering animals, letting his ears judge every distant sound. Naira didn't question it. She had already learned that Eli's idea of rest wasn't like other men's. They each lived with different kinds of vigilance. As he prepared the mule, Naira picked up a small handful of rocks and arranged them into a loose pattern on the ground. 2 lines pointing northwest, one scratched mark indicating direction. Eli paused, watching. "You leaving a sign?" he asked, recognizing the method from her people. "No," she said. "I'm practicing. I haven't used markers in months. My hands feel slow." She brushed a thumb across one of the lines. "If anyone from my band passed through here later, they'd know someone was traveling on foot. They'd know it wasn't a trap." Eli nodded. It answered a question listeners would have wondered about, whether she had any way of communicating with her people if she ever tried to find them again. She did, and she was reclaiming those skills day by day. They set out soon after, moving through a stretch of land where dried plants created a soft crunch beneath their boots. The air warmed faster here, pushing away the morning chill. Naira walked beside Eli, matching his pace more evenly than she had before. He noticed the slight change in her breathing, a steady rhythm instead of sharp, uneven pulls. She was regaining strength, not just physically, but in ways she couldn't yet name. After an hour, Eli stopped suddenly and raised a hand again for silence. Naira froze. She had learned to trust that gesture. He crouched low, examining a shallow indentation in the dirt. It wasn't a hoof print this time, just a mark where someone had knelt, maybe to rest, maybe to tie a boot. The soil was still disturbed, not yet dry. "Someone was here before dawn," he said. "Maybe one person." Light footsteps. Naira felt her stomach tighten, but not with the same panic as earlier in the journey. "Do you think they saw us?" she asked. "No," Eli said. "If they had, we'd have more tracks circling." He examined the mark again and added, "Could be a hunter. Could be someone running from trouble. Could be nothing." The possibility eased her tension. He wasn't jumping to fear. He was assessing realistically, something she valued more each day. As they continued, the landscape shifted into rolling grassland with patches of scattered sagebrush. The openness gave Naira a sense of relief. She could see for long distances without worrying about ambush points. Still, a new question tugged at her mind, one she had not asked yet, but felt listeners might wonder. If your home is so far from towns, how do you get the supplies you need? Eli shrugged as he tightened his grip on the mule's lead rope. "Every few months, I ride into a settlement, usually farther west than the market we came from. I trade pelts, tools I've made, sometimes dried meat. Don't need much." He paused. "Don't want much." She studied his profile. His answer wasn't surprising, but it filled in another missing piece about how he survived alone. She wondered how he had lived through winters without help, how he managed sickness, how he kept loneliness from swallowing him whole. That last thought lingered longer than she wanted to admit. By midday, the sun sat almost directly overhead, pushing shadows into thin slivers under their feet. Eli slowed their pace. "You're quiet today," he said. "So are you," she replied. He gave a faint huff that wasn't quite a laugh. That's not new. She shifted the strap on her shoulder. I'm thinking. About what? She hesitated. The words formed slowly. I keep trying to remember if my sister had time to run. Before they took me, she pushed me behind a rock and told me not to move. I didn't listen. I followed her. I thought staying close meant we would survive together. Her breath hitched slightly. I haven't stopped wondering what she'd say if she saw me now. If she'd think I should be with you or go back, or something else. Eli didn't look at her while she spoke. Instead, he kept his eyes on the horizon, letting her talk without interruption. When she finished, he spoke carefully. If she survived, she'd want you alive. That's the only certainty you can count on right now. He paused. And staying alive isn't betrayal. It's survival. Naira absorbed his words slowly. They didn't erase her guilt, but they softened the sharpest edge of it. They reached a narrow stream bed by late afternoon. Unlike the dried one they had passed earlier, this one carried a thin trickle of water running over flat stones. The sound was faint but constant. Eli tested the depth with his boot. It's clean, he said. You can refill your pouch. Naira knelt beside the water, lifting the pouch to let the stream fill it. As she worked, she noticed a reflection, dust on her cheeks, dried blood near her temple, hair tangled from wind and sleep. She had not looked at herself closely since her capture. The sight made her throat tighten unexpectedly. She didn't want Eli to see her reaction, but he noticed the tension anyway. He didn't move toward her. He just spoke quietly. There's soap at my place. Clean clothes, too. You don't have to keep the dress if it brings back bad memories. Her eyes snapped to him. You already planned for that. Figured you'd want the choice, he said. Nothing else. The way he framed it, choice, struck her again. Everything with Eli returned to that idea. She wasn't a burden or a debt or a possession. She was a person making decisions in a world that had stolen almost all of them from her. When she stood, water dripping from her fingers, Eli motioned toward the west. My land starts past that ridge. We'll reach home before nightfall if we keep a steady pace. Naira's heart picked up slightly, not with fear, but with a strange mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. She hadn't been in a place she could call safe since before her capture, and the idea of entering a home she had never seen brought a tightness to her chest that she couldn't quite name. As they climbed the final slope, Eli pointed to a faint smoke line rising far in the distance. That's from my chimney, he said. Left a log burning before I went to the market, so the place wouldn't freeze. Naira blinked in surprise. You keep a fire going even when you're gone? Only when the nights turn cold, he said. A warm cabin feels less empty. She didn't miss the unspoken truth beneath his words. He hated returning to silence, so thick it felt like a second skin. She understood that feeling too well. They reached the top of the ridge. Below them, a valley opened wide, and tucked near a cluster of cottonwoods stood a small wooden cabin with a slanted roof, a fence corral, and a shed built from mismatched boards. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney. There were no other houses in sight, no trails used by travelers, no immediate signs of danger. Just quiet land stretching to the horizon. Naira stared down at the cabin for a long moment. Her breath steadied, her pulse slowed, and a feeling she hadn't let herself consider crept into her chest. Hope that this place might allow her to breathe without fear. Eli watched her expression carefully. If you stay, he said softly, you stay because you want to, not because you owe me, not because you have nowhere else. She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. I know. He gave a small nod. Then let's head down. As they began the descent toward the cabin, Naira felt something shift inside her. The fear that had followed her since her capture didn't vanish, but loosened enough for something new to enter, an understanding that the life waiting below might not be temporary survival. It might be the beginning of belonging. The slope leading down to Eli's cabin looked gentler from the ridge, but once they began their descent, loose stones shifted under their feet and forced them to slow down. Naira stepped carefully, placing each foot with deliberate precision, while Eli walked slightly ahead, testing the ground with the heel of his boot. The wind carried the crisp scent of pine, mixed with wood smoke rising from the chimney below, and every step brought them closer to a place that felt too quiet to be dangerous, yet too unfamiliar to relax in completely. When they reached the base of the ridge, the cabin stood clearer than before. Its boards were weathered but well fitted, the porch supported by sturdy beams, and a small window near the door emitted a faint flicker from the fire Eli had left burning. Naira had expected a place barely holding itself together, something like the shelter she had hidden in during her worst months. Instead, the structure looked lived in, maintained by someone who cared enough to keep it standing through harsh seasons. It answered a question listeners might have asked, whether Eli truly had roots here or was only drifting. He had built a life, however quiet. As they approached, Naira slowed, taking in everything. The worn path leading to the door, the small stack of tools leaning neatly against the wall, and the row of chopped logs arranged near the porch. She touched the top of one log lightly, feeling the rough grain beneath her fingers. "You cut all these alone?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Work keeps the mind steady," he said. "Helps the winters pass." The statement revealed more than he seemed to intend. It gave her insight into the months he had spent isolated, wrestling with memories he rarely shared. She stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking softly under her weight. Eli opened the door, gesturing for her to enter first. She hesitated, uncertainty pressing in her chest, then crossed the threshold. The cabin's interior was small but neat. A wood stove stood near the corner with a kettle resting on top. A handmade table occupied the center, with 2 chairs pushed in close. Shelves lined one wall, holding a few tins of food, a pair of worn books, and a folded blanket. A small bed was tucked against the far wall, covered with a thick quilt sewn from mismatched fabric. Everything inside was arranged with care, nothing left scattered or broken. It didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like a home someone maintained even when no one else was there to see. Eli set his hat on a peg near the door. "You can wash up behind the cabin," he said. "There's a barrel of water I filled last night. It's cold but clean." Naira took a step toward the back door, then paused. A question had been sitting in her mind since they reached the ridge, one listeners would surely ask. "Will anyone come here? Neighbors? Travelers?" "No," Eli said. "This land's off the main roads. People don't pass unless they're lost. And the nearest ranch is half a day away." His calm tone carried reassurance rather than dismissal. "You're safe here." The certainty in his voice anchored her. She slipped outside to the back of the cabin, where the barrel sat under a slanted overhang. She dipped her hands into the cold water, gasping softly as it chilled her skin. She washed her face, arms, and neck, wiping away the dirt and dried sweat that had clung to her for days. When she ran her fingers through her tangled hair, feathers slipped loose, falling into the grass. She stared at them for a moment, not knowing whether to pick them up or let them stay on the ground. Inside the cabin, Eli had placed a folded shirt and pair of trousers on the table. They were clearly his, larger, rougher, but washed and patched. He also laid out a clean piece of cloth she could use as a belt. He wasn't sure whether she'd want them, but he offered anyway. When she came in, water still clinging to her skin, he stepped aside. "They'll fit well enough until we find something better." Naira touched the fabric, running her thumb across the stitching. "Why do you have extra clothes?" she asked, a hint of caution in her voice. Eli exhaled slowly. "Had a friend who used to stay here from time to time. A wanderer. He left them behind." The detail wasn't rehearsed. It was simple truth that explained something listeners would wonder, whether Eli had ever shared his space with anyone before. He had, but rarely, and not in a way that tied him to others. Naira changed behind a hanging curtain Eli had pulled across the corner. When she stepped out, the loose shirt hung to her thighs, and the trousers, cinched with the cloth belt, gave her a freedom of movement her torn dress hadn't. She glanced at Eli, catching a brief flicker of surprise in his expression. Not the kind that objectified her, but the kind that registered how different she looked now, less like someone who had been dragged through suffering and more like someone who belonged somewhere. "You look more comfortable," he said, the words quiet, almost careful. "I feel different," she replied. She didn't know how else to describe the sensation of wearing clothing that didn't remind her of being grabbed, tied, or sold. Eli stoked the fire in the stove and set the kettle to warm. The scent of heated metal and smoke filled the small cabin. After a few minutes, he ladled warm water into a cup and handed it to her. Not too close, still giving her the space she had come to expect. She accepted it with both hands. They sat across from each other at the table. Naira studied him thoughtfully. "You haven't asked me what I want to do now that we're here," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were sure," he replied. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, "but I know I don't want to run anymore." Eli met her gaze with a calm steadiness. "Then you won't." A quiet moment passed between them, broken only by the soft pop of wood inside the stove. Naira set her cup down, gathering her thoughts. "You said last night that your cabin doesn't ask anything from you," she said. "Then what do you want from it now?" Eli looked around the small room with an expression that was almost reflective. "Peace," he said. "Enough quiet to think straight. A place where things don't fall apart because someone else made a choice for me." Naira considered his answer. "And having me here, does it change that?" "It changes the quiet," he said truthfully, but not in a bad way. His honesty reached her deeper than she expected. She'd feared she would be a burden or an interruption. Hearing otherwise lifted a weight she hadn't recognized until it left her. Later, when Eli stepped outside to bring him more firewood, Naira walked around the cabin, letting her fingers brush every surface: walls, windowsill, table edge, as if memorizing the space. She stopped near the bed, touching the quilt lightly. Questions filled her mind. Where would she sleep? Would she share the cabin without being expected to share anything else? Would she be allowed to stay as long as needed? Before she could ask, Eli re-entered, shaking dust from his sleeves. He noticed her standing near the bed and spoke gently. "You can sleep there tonight. I'll take the porch." She turned, startled. "The porch? It's cold. I've slept out there plenty of times," he said. "If you're here, you get the safer spot." Her throat tightened with emotion she didn't know how to express. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I'm doing it anyway." The final question listeners would have wondered, whether Eli expected closeness or intended to take advantage, was answered without her even needing to ask. His boundaries were clear. His intentions were clean. And for the first time since she had been dragged from her home, Naira felt the unfamiliar heaviness of fear replaced by something smaller, steadier, and far more dangerous: trust. As night approached and Eli stepped out to prepare the porch, Naira watched him through the window. His slow movements, his concern for her comfort, and the quiet way he accepted her presence without conditions. She lay down on the bed later, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. The cabin was still, the fire crackling softly, and for the first time in months, she allowed her eyes to close without expecting violence to wake her. Outside, Eli leaned against the porch post, rifle resting near his boots, listening to the night. Not guarding her because she needed guarding, but because the world had failed her enough times. And he wouldn't let it fail her again. The first sound Naira heard the next morning was the soft crack of wood shifting inside the stove, followed by the faint scrape of boots on the porch. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim cabin light where the sun had only just started creeping through the small window near the bed. The quilt felt warm across her body, and for a few seconds she let herself simply breathe, taking in the strange sensation of waking without dread. She sat up, listening closely. Eli's footsteps moved toward the cabin door, steady and deliberate. When he stepped inside, his clothes carried the smell of early morning air, pine, cold earth, and a hint of smoke. He removed his hat and set it on the peg without making a sound that suggested urgency or alarm. "You sleep all right?" he asked quietly. "I did," she said, surprised by how true the words felt. It struck her that listeners would wonder if she had nightmares, given her months of trauma. She had expected them too, but none came. Exhaustion and safety had claimed her first. Eli nodded, relieved but trying not to show it too clearly. "Good. Fire's going. Water's warm enough for tea." She pulled the quilt aside, rose slowly, and stretched her stiff muscles. It was the first morning she had greeted without being tied, shoved, or told where to stand. The realization hit her stronger than she expected, and she held the edge of the table briefly to steady herself. Eli noticed the flicker of emotion, but didn't comment. He busied himself grinding dried leaves for tea, as if giving her a moment to gather her thoughts. Naira watched him, studying something she hadn't fully understood before. He was careful with silence, not because he feared saying the wrong thing, but because he respected what either of them might need to keep to themselves. After they drank a warm cup each, Eli stepped outside to check the animals. She followed him out onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself as the cold morning air brushed her skin. The mule stood near the trough, shaking its ears. Eli ran a hand along its neck, checking the coat for any sign of stress or injury. Naira leaned against one of the porch posts, feeling the smooth wood beneath her palms. "I want to help," she said. Eli turned his head slightly. "You don't have to work today." "I know," she said. "I want to." For the first time since he'd met her, a trace of warmth touched his face. Not quite a smile, but something close enough to change the tension around his eyes. "Then we'll start with something simple." He showed her how to refill the trough using a bucket hanging near the shed. The task was light, but for Naira, it felt like an important step in owning her place here. While she carried the bucket, she noticed the corral fence and the tools stacked neatly against the shed. Something had been bothering her since yesterday. Listeners would wonder too, did Eli expect her to stay in the cabin all the time? Was she allowed to walk the land alone? She set the bucket down and asked the question directly. "How far can I go from the cabin without worrying you?" He paused at the gate, considering her words. "Anywhere within sight of the porch," he said. Past the line of trees there, he pointed toward a small cluster of oaks. The ground drops into a ravine. Hard to climb back up. Wouldn't want you stuck if something happened. "So you're saying I'm free to walk?" she asked. "You're free to do anything you choose," he answered plainly. The reassurance steadied something deep inside her. She had not felt free in so long that the concept felt unfamiliar, like touching a forgotten object from childhood. After they finished with the mule, Eli checked the shed and returned with a small basket. "We'll gather kindling near the cottonwoods," he said. "There's always fallen branches after a cold night." Naira followed him across the yard, feeling the soft soil under her borrowed boots. The cottonwoods were taller up close, their trunks carved with the rough lines of age. As she bent to pick up a branch, she noticed a faint mark on one of the lower trunks, an old axe strike, not fresh but deliberate. She brushed her fingers over it. "You cut here before," she said. "Once," he replied. "Needed wood fast. Storm hit that week." "Do you get storms often?" "A few," he said. "This valley takes the worst of it. Cabin holds well enough." His answer filled another gap listeners might wonder about, whether the cabin could withstand the harsh seasons. As they gathered wood, a question that had been tugging at Naira finally made its way to her voice. "How did your brothers die?" she asked softly, unsure if she had the right to ask, but needing to understand the man who had saved her. Eli straightened slowly, his expression shifting as memories moved behind his eyes. He set the branch in the basket before answering. "Argument at a saloon turned bad. They stepped in to break it up. Wrong man got nervous. Shot before thinking. I wasn't there. By the time I arrived, they were already gone." Naira lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Nothing for you to be sorry about. Life took a turn I wasn't ready for. That's all." His voice didn't crack, but the strain beneath it was unmistakable. She realized he carried guilt not for what he had done, but for what he wasn't there to stop. Her own guilt mirrored his, though for different reasons. As they continued collecting branches, Naira asked another question listeners would wonder. "Your friend who left his clothes. Where is he now?" "Gone north," Eli said. "Caught wagon work with a freight line. Said he needed more people around than I could give him. Haven't heard from him since." It told her something important. Eli didn't chase people who left. He didn't cling. He let others choose their path, even if it meant he ended up alone again. When the basket was full, they carried it back to the cabin. Naira set it down near the porch while Eli checked the sky. The sun was climbing, warming the land and making the frost along the ground melt into thin beads. She stood beside him, following his gaze. "You watch the land like it's speaking to you," she said. "It usually is," he replied. "What's it saying now?" He scanned the horizon once more. Weather's turning mild. No riders near. Trail's quiet. Good day for settling in. She didn't miss the phrasing, settling in, not visiting, not staying temporarily. It made her heart shift in her chest. Inside the cabin, she swept the floor with a small broom while Eli trimmed the wick on the oil lamp. The simple tasks filled the silence with purpose rather than tension. At one point, Eli paused and looked at her. If you ever want something changed in here, he said, say so. Her eyebrows lifted. Changed? Why would I change anything? Because you live here now, he said. The words landed deeper than he probably intended. She had expected a temporary arrangement, something that lasted only until she found her strength or another path. Hearing him acknowledge her presence as something permanent, or at least welcomed, filled her with a sense of stability she hadn't thought she'd feel again. Later that afternoon, Naira took a brief walk around the cabin's perimeter. The land stretched in every direction, open and quiet. She saw tracks of small animals, the worn path Eli used to haul wood, and the faint outline of a garden plot near the western side of the cabin. It had been dormant for months, but still held the shape of something tended with care. You grow food? She asked when Eli joined her near the garden. Corn sometimes, he said. Beans and squash on good years. Haven't planted since last spring. Will you plant again? Maybe, he said. If there's two of us, it'll be easier to keep it going. Naira's breath hitched softly. The idea of building something, anything, after so much loss both comforted and frightened her. But as she looked at the empty plot, she didn't imagine it with dread. She imagined it with possibility. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the yard, Naira followed Eli up the porch steps. She stopped at the doorway, looking at the quiet room inside. Eli, she said gently. He turned. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe anywhere again. You are, he said simply, and I didn't think anyone would let me decide my own future. You decide every part of it, he replied. The sincerity in his voice settled something in her that had been shaking since the day she was taken. She didn't smile. She wasn't ready for that. But her expression softened into something closer to relief than fear. As Eli stepped inside to prepare supper, Naira lingered on the porch for a moment, letting the evening breeze brush across her face. The land was calm, the cabin steady, and the man inside had given her something no chain, no traitor, no threat had ever taken away. A place where her choices mattered. And for the first time in too long, she stepped inside not as a shadow of a woman running from danger, but as someone who could imagine a life beginning again. The last traces of daylight faded behind the ridge, leaving a soft blue haze over the valley as Naira and Eli finished their simple supper. The cabin felt warmer than usual, not because of the fire, but because Naira moved through it with steady steps instead of hesitation. She placed the tin plates in a small basin near the stove, rinsing them with warm water while Eli stacked the remaining wood for the night. His movements were quiet, methodical, always checking the windows, always sensing the land in ways she still didn't fully understand. For a moment, she leaned her hands on the table, breathing slowly as she absorbed everything she had learned since arriving. She understood now that the listeners would wonder about details left unspoken. How well she knew the layout of the cabin, whether she feared the isolated positioning of the home, what dangers existed nearby, and what Eli did when nights grew longer and colder. Chapter 8 would answer those questions naturally. Is winter harsh here? She asked as she dried her hands. Eli placed the last piece of wood beside the stove and wiped the sweat from his brow. Cold enough to freeze water solid in the trough, he said. Wind cuts through the ridge. Cabin holds, but you have to prepare early. He opened a drawer and showed her bundles of dried herbs, strips of cured meat, and a row of candles he had made himself. This is how I get through the long nights. Naira studied the drawer, impressed by how carefully he planned. You do all this alone every year? Up until now, he answered, closing the drawer gently. His tone wasn't possessive, nor did it imply obligation. It simply acknowledged that her presence changed the rhythm of his days, and he wasn't shying away from it. After cleaning the table, Naira stood by the window, looking at the darkened yard. The land was so still it almost made her uneasy. She had lived among movement, running, hiding, watching, so long that calmness felt unfamiliar. "Does anything come this close to the cabin at night?" she asked. "Coyotes sometimes," Eli said, sitting at the edge of the bed to oil the lever of his rifle. "Deer in the fall. Stray cattle during dry spells. Nothing that'll bother you as long as we're here." "And people?" she asked softly. He paused, lifting his eyes to her. "People don't wander out here without reason," he said. "And if they do, they avoid homes unless they know the owner." "What if they know you?" she asked. "No one's looking for me," he said. "And anyone who used to stopped years ago." The answer brought a new question to her mind, one the listeners would likely ask too. "You said your brothers died in a saloon fight. But what happened after? Why didn't you stay in town?" Eli rested the rifle beside him and folded his hands. The quiet in the cabin deepened. "I stayed long enough to bury them," he said. "But every corner looked like a place they used to stand. Every sound reminded me of the night I wasn't there. I couldn't breathe right." He rubbed his thumb against the edge of his palm. "So I left." Naira stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Did anyone try to stop you?" "A few, but they didn't understand." He met her eyes with a rare vulnerability. "I didn't run from duty. I ran from grief. There's a difference." Her chest tightened at the honesty. She knew what grief could turn a person into: silent, sharp-edged, careful not to feel too much. She saw those same shadows in him. Eli stood, tying the curtain tighter across the back window. "Storm clouds moving in," he said. "We might get wind tonight." Naira moved toward the stove, adding one more log to keep the cabin warm. As the flames brightened, she noticed something she hadn't before: a small wooden box tucked under the bed frame. Curiosity flickered across her face. "What's inside that?" she asked. Eli turned, following her gaze. For a moment he hesitated, weighing whether to answer. Then he reached down and pulled the box out. "Old things," he said. "Nothing dangerous." He placed it on the table and opened the lid. Inside were a few faded letters, a broken pocket watch, and a strip of cloth wrapped around a small eagle feather. Naira touched the feather gently. "Whose was this?" "My brother Luke found it on the trail," Eli said quietly. "Said it meant strength. Used to keep it in his pocket." Naira swallowed hard. He believed in signs. He believed in keeping reminders, Eli said. Said the world only takes everything if you let it. She understood why he kept the box, but rarely opened it. It wasn't a shrine. It was a place where memories were contained so they wouldn't spill over and swallow him. She closed the lid slowly. "Thank you for showing me," she said. "You didn't have to." "You asked," he said simply. The wind outside picked up, brushing against the cabin walls with a low whistle. Naira moved toward the bed, pulling the quilt back. Then she stopped when she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier: a second folded blanket placed neatly at the foot of the bed. "You put this here," she said, touching it lightly. "I figured you might want another layer," he said, adjusting the lantern wick. "Or space to wrap around you if the wind gets loud." Her eyes softened. "You think of everything." "No," he said, "just whatever might make things easier." She turned toward him fully. "Eli," she said quietly, "I feel safe here. That hasn't happened to me in a very long time." He didn't respond with words. Instead, he gave a single slow nod, acknowledging the importance of what she said without pressing it further. As she settled onto the bed, Eli prepared the porch again, placing his blanket in the same spot as the night before. But before he stepped outside, Naira spoke softly. "You can sleep inside." He paused, hand on the doorknob. "I won't be afraid," she added. "Not of you." He considered her words carefully, then shook his head. "Not tonight. You need the room more than I do." She didn't argue. His decision wasn't about distance. It was about respect. And she no longer feared what his choices meant. After he closed the door, Naira lay in the quiet, listening to the steady rhythm of the wind. The fire cast faint shadows on the walls. Outside, Eli shifted his weight on the porch, his boot tapping once against the floorboards as he settled in. Listeners might have wondered whether she missed her sister, whether the safety of this cabin felt like betrayal to the family she lost. The truth settled in her chest now. She could hold grief and hope at the same time. They did not cancel each other out. Her eyes closed slowly, warm beneath the quilt, heart calmer than the night before. She felt the cabin around her, strong walls, soft light, the safety of a man who had no intentions of hurting her. And for the first time, sleep did not feel like surrender. Outside, Eli remained alert beneath the stars, listening for danger that never came. And inside, Naira finally rested not as a captive, not as someone surviving on fear, but as a woman beginning to imagine a life where she might choose to stay. A thin strip of morning light slipped through the window when Naira woke, spreading across the quilt in a pale line. The wind had quieted some time during the night, leaving the air still enough that she could hear the gentle creak of the porch boards where Eli leaned against the post, stretching the stiffness out of his shoulders. Her heartbeat steadied as she took in the room, warm, calm, unchanged. She sat up slowly, the quilt pooling around her waist, and for a brief moment simply watched him through the doorway, noticing how his breath fogged faintly in the cold, and how his hand rested near the rifle not from fear, but habit. She rose and stepped onto the porch, her bare feet cold against the boards. Eli turned toward her with a quiet nod, as if he'd been waiting to see her eyes open before moving on with the day. "Morning," he said, his voice low from hours spent awake. "You didn't sleep?" she asked, a concerned crease forming between her brows. "Some," he answered. "Enough to hear trouble if it came." "It didn't." She hesitated, then spoke the question listeners might have carried since the beginning. "Will you always stay awake so I can sleep?" He studied her expression, considering the weight of what she was truly asking. "No," he said gently. "Not always. Only until you feel safe enough not to worry." He added with quiet sincerity, "And you're close to that. I can see it." Her shoulders eased. She didn't know how to respond to kindness given without expectation. So she stepped to the edge of the porch and watched the valley below. The early light revealed something new. Light smoke drifting from a distant ridge, far off but distinct. It wasn't from Eli's land. It belonged to someone else. "There's a fire out there," she said. Eli followed her gaze. "Campfire," he confirmed. "Too small to be a settlement. Might be hunters. Could be travelers. They're far enough not to worry us." "People are moving through these hills again?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Season changes bring folks through the pass. But they don't come this far unless they're lost." A question formed in her mind. One listeners might wonder as well. "If they wandered here, would you send them away?" Eli looked out across the valley, thinking. "Depends who they are," he said plainly. "But no one will touch you. Not here." Her breath steadied again at his certainty. She stepped back inside to prepare a small breakfast, something simple she'd watched him make the day before. She sliced a piece of dried meat and placed it on the pan over the stove, letting the cabin warm with the familiar scent. Eli watched her quietly, recognizing how different her movements were now. Confident, purposeful, at ease in a space that had not belonged to her yesterday, but felt right today. When they finished eating, Naira returned to the corner where Eli had stored his wooden box. She didn't open it again, but rested her hand on the lid. "You said your brother kept this feather for strength," she said. "Do you keep anything of your own for the same reason?" Eli pulled a small leather cord from his pocket. Attached was a worn brass button. "From my father's coat," he said. "I take it with me whenever I ride far." She stepped closer, studying the simple object. "What did he teach you?" "That a man's word means more than anything he owns," Eli said, "and that you stand with someone when they need you, not when it's easy." The words settled deep inside her, clarifying something listeners would have wondered through the earlier chapters. Why Eli helped her, why he stayed patient, why he protected her without asking anything in return. It was how he was raised. Naira held his gaze for a long moment. "You've done that for me," she said. "I know," he replied. "And I'll keep doing it if you want me to." His voice did not waver. It didn't hide emotion behind distance or brevity. It was the plain truth of a man who understood commitment. Naira stepped to the table, pulling out the small cloth belt she'd tied around her borrowed trousers the day before. Her hand shook, not with fear, but with the decision she was finally ready to make. "Eli," she said softly, "I want to stay." He froze, just slightly, the way a man does when hearing something he didn't dare hope for. "Stay how?" he asked carefully. She swallowed, lifting her chin with quiet resolve. "Here, in this cabin, on this land." With you. Her throat tightened, but she kept going. Not because you paid for me. Not because I'm afraid of leaving. Because I choose this. Silence filled the room, heavy with meaning but without tension. Eli stepped closer, moving slowly, so she had time to step back if she wished. She didn't. If you stay, he said quietly, it's your home as much as mine. I want that, she whispered. Eli's breath moved out in a relieved exhale. He reached for her hand, slow, deliberate, waiting until she offered it fully. When her fingers curled into his, something steady and warm anchored in both of them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was a decision sealed in the simplest gesture. But the listeners would wonder about one more thing: their future, their safety, their belonging. And Naira spoke that question aloud. What happens now? What do we build? What will our life look like? Eli glanced out the window, then back at her. It looks like whatever we make of it, he said. We'll plant a garden, fix the fence, hunt for the winter, make the cabin warmer. And if someone ever comes asking who you are, he paused, giving her the choice. You can choose your name, your story, your place. Her eyes softened. My name is Naira, she said, and I want my story to continue here. Eli nodded once, a rare and genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. Then Naira it is. He walked to the shelf, pulled down a small carving tool, and handed it to her. If you want this to be your home, he said, etch your name on the beam beside the door. That's how I mark this place as mine. You can mark it too. Her breath shook as she took the tool. She stepped to the doorway, running her fingers over the smooth wood. With slow precision, she carved 4 letters, NEIRA, into the beam. Each cut felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been torn away. When she finished, Eli stepped beside her and placed his calloused hand over hers for a brief moment. Welcome home, he said quietly. The simple phrase settled deep inside her, making her chest warm with a feeling she hadn't known in months: belonging. They spent the rest of the morning gathering wood, checking the roof, and preparing for the days ahead. When the distant campfire smoke finally faded from the ridge, neither of them watched for danger anymore. They watched it disappear with relief, knowing the world might still be harsh, but they weren't facing it alone. As the sun climbed high, Naira walked the yard with steady steps, memorizing the land not as a place she passed through, but as a place she would help shape. Eli joined her, his hand brushing lightly against hers, not claiming her, not leading her, just standing beside her in a way that said every path forward would be walked together. By midday, the valley stretched open and quiet before them. And for the first time since her capture, Naira felt no fear at the thought of tomorrow. She felt only peace, and the steady promise of a life she chose, and a man who chose her back.